Look, with high cliffs and streams and fields. Why, if I could buy another 1,300 acres, the park would be complete. And not only will it invite people, but it'll invite people to create bigger and better towns. It'll be a real amenity here. This was just before the dark days of the stock market crash and the Great Depression. But William Ward, a good, fiscally conservative Republican, managed to persevere, and the legislature agreed to expand this park. It was called Pound Ridge Reservation. Now, the dark days of the Depression came, and people didn't just seek refuge in the park, but they wanted work. They needed work. Thus, the Civilian Conservation Corps got called out by, again, William Ward. I need trails made, trees planted. I need to make sure that, well, this place will be inviting, not just a stretch of woods. And thus the CCC arrived, with shovels over their shoulders and rucksacks in hand. They arrived to just a wilderness. They passed by some old shacks, once used by a fellow by the name of Maston, to cut down trees and to make charcoal for some of the blast furnaces in the realm. Now they served as a bit of inspiration. We can make our barracks over here. And borrowing from the military, they began to make barracks, neat, nice. Tearing up some of the stones from the old stone walls, they quickly worked together and made places to live. Then they went to work, for real. They planted trees, pines, spruce, to grow tall and straight and to provide not just solace, but a place for people to wander. And they worked hard, those CCC men. Why, they often said, do we work hard? Indeed. Why, we work 60 minutes out of every hour. The pay's decent, the food's good, but the company is even better. The CCC dug out trails and put up places, shelters where people could go and camp. And they planted, again, 500,000 trees. And then during the height of that Great Depression, William Ward passed away. But a few years later, the Bedford Garden Club, led by Delilah and Eloise, said, we best honor the memory of William Ward and follow the path he began here to blaze. We need to make this place all the more inviting. It'll be rather like a Central Park up in northern Westchester. But in Central Park, you find gardens. Well, we know that William Wheeler. He's a fine botanist. Perhaps he can establish for us a wildflower garden. And thus William Wheeler arrived at Pound Ridge, now called Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, after the visionary William Ward. But now the botanist William Wheeler put forth his vision. We can have a wildflower garden indeed. And the Garden Club, you've been instrumental in digging up various plants and collecting them together, but it would be all the more appealing if we were to have, why, a nature center, a trailside museum. Why, we could have displays, everything from, well, the various ferns that grow here to, well, salamanders and snakes, and perhaps even a place for the chipmunks to run. I think if I can petition our congressman in Washington, why, he may be able to let this all happen. And thus William Wheeler went to Washington and visited with Hamilton Fish, a fierce fellow. one who fiercely opposed Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But Wheeler managed to use his charm. He brought forth some fern leaves and wild marshmallow and presented these as reason to have a nature museum at Ward Pound Ridge Reservation. Well, Fish looked at these things and said, "They smell sweet. Perhaps I can allocate some money to create this. It'll bring growth to our community." And thus, in 1941, the beginnings of the Trailside Museum got created, with ferns and flowers and little beasties crawling around within the wooden cabinets made by the last crew of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the wildflower garden began to prosper right along Slosson's Trail, which went way off into the woods to a great rock where spies from the American Revolution, Luther Kennicott, watched and saw the redcoats come to burn down Bedford and Pound Ridge. And eventually, when more and more visitors came, a fire tower got set. There wasn't much call to put out fires, but the young man who got called to that tower, Nicholas Shumatov, found another calling. Wandering along Slosson's Trail, past the Nature Museum built by William Wheeler and the park created by William Ward, Nicholas Shumatov discovered signs of the native peoples. One got inscribed in a great stone. He noticed when he rubbed his hand across it etchings, images of bear, deer, fox, and wolf. He called in a local expert on native lore who said, yes, these are petroglyphs. Petroglyphs. Perhaps others should be able to come and see these petroglyphs. And that gave Nicholas Shumatov an idea. He did two things. He began to give tours to see the petroglyphs, and he got, after much doing, in 1976, a grant to study the native peoples who may have etched that stone with the bear and the deer, creating the petroglyphs. Eventually, Nicholas Shumatov brought native peoples to those petroglyphs, and they had a little cleansing ceremony to open it up for the public. And then a few years went by, and this storyteller arrived at Pound Ridge Museum for a walk to discover not just wild flowers, but edible ones, useful ones. And there I met a fellow who had a grape leaf attached to his head. He talked about how you could eat cattail and arrowhead root and even skunk cabbage. And to cool off, you can put this leaf upon your head from the wild grape, cools you down at once. I wondered, how did you come up with this program of edible plants and later the visit to the petroglyphs? He told me, all of this is in the story of this park. And then it struck. Every park, no matter how small or humble its origins, has a story within it. And if you begin by looking at a problem that helped generate the creation of that park, you can tell its story and create programs around what's in the park. And that's indeed what has happened at Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, even to this day. And it's something that, for the rest of the time we have, I'd like to help you create out of your parks. So, I'm interested now if one of you is thinking about your park, and if you would just briefly, in a bare bones way, share it, I'll take hold of it as a professional storyteller with 30 years of experience to turn it into a story. And I'll begin first by telling you that a story has basic ingredients. It's not just the facts that could be William Ward established in 1925 3,000 acres that became Pound Ridge Reservation. He added additional acres and it became Ward Pound Ridge Reservation. William Wheeler came along and created the little nature museum. Eloise and Delilah made the wildflower garden, and Nicholas Shumatov created programs like a walk to the Petroglyphs or the edible plants programs. That's the bare bones. A story begins with a problem, has steps to solve it, and then has kind of a surprise at the end. The surprise, as I end this story of Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, is that now tens of thousands of people come, even during these COVID times, to enjoy walks through the park on trails built by the CCC and through programs established by the likes of Nicholas Shumatov. So, even if one of you just shares one aspect of the formation of your park, I'll endeavor now to use my skills as a storyteller and my experience presenting programs at parks over the years based on those parks to help you. So is there someone who'd like to unmute and share something about their park? And we'll see if we can turn it into a program. Anyone here willing to speak out, speak up? Be careful, because if you're feeling shy, and I certainly understand, I'll give you an example of how a program can be developed. Westchester County, New York, has a place called the Muscoot Park. It was a working farm until the 1960s, and then the county acquired the property. And it took years to develop it into a place where people could safely visit without falling down an old well or having the old barn drop a piece of siding upon someone's head. And I recall having the director turn to me and ask if there was some kind of a program that could be developed. And the obvious one came to mind, which was to have something based on a working farm. I then looked for stories that had things to do with farms and found one called that I turned into Lucky John. And it gives all the different animals that John got after he had worked on a farm from the wealthy or presiding farm. And I also realized that farms have chores, and children may be unaware of the chores. So we set up outside a program based on farm chores. We had someone who could churn butter, and the kids could do that. A blacksmith who would give them a turn hammering metal, not too hot. We had someone who showed the kids how to milk the cow, and that proved to be the most popular of the programs. And someone who just happened to be along who knew about basket weaving, which we discovered during the 19th century in that vicinity. Muscoot Farm was a provision made by the last remaining native peoples. So we found a basket weaver who knew native styles, and we got the kids doing that. And that hands-on element sprang right from the history of Muscoot Farms. and it's been a successful program ever since. Personally, my favorite program developed out of, again, Ward Pound Ridge Reservation. People would go there to this 4,000-acre reserve, and even though they got confused when they found it was called Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, they thought there was a tribe of native people named the Pounds or the Ward. But that led to a program, Pound Ridge. Yeah, this is just a tiny aspect of how one little bit of your park's history can become a program. Pound Ridge came from a cliff at one edge, the northern edge of the park, and the native peoples would make an impoundment of a few acres, and they would drive deer into that impoundment. So during the lean winter months, they could more easily hunt a deer to provide food and clothing. And thus, Pound Ridge got named after that place. So we decided to build on that and create a program for Native peoples. And they did two things. They brought in Native peoples and people who had found arrowheads. And we also brought in a fellow named Jeff Colleen, who did flint knapping, who showed kids especially how to take a stone and make it into an arrowhead. And that all originated from the authentic aspect of the park where the native people made those pounds. Now, people also felt a bit of enchantment visiting Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, watching the mists rise over the fields. And years later, after the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, the fields had begun from the remaining farms to grow over. There were few farms there. I think currently there may be just a half dozen. Outhouse orchards and some others there remain. They're mostly kind of fruit and vegetable stands, but they still are considered working farms. So when people would visit Pound Ridge and look at the mists rising over the fields, some began to say, it's like a fairyland. And that gave that fellow, Nicholas Shumatov, a bit of a brainstorm. He knew I was interested in folklore and fairy tales, and he asked, could I create a fairy tale walk for families at Ward Pound Ridge Reservation? And with some doing and some help, and help meaning creating little stick and leaf and flower houses where the fairies may dwell, we created the first annual tour of the places of the little people. And that program has been enduring and continuing annually for now 30 years. Got thrown off course a bit by the pandemic, but walking along with your iPhone, you can create little virtual tours to draw virtual visitors and keep your brand up, keep people interested in your park. And it doesn't take very much. A 1-minute piece can sometimes generate lots of interest. And with masks, you can lead some smaller hikes to see some of the places in your park. So again, has anyone got something in your park that you feel may be of interest, but you're looking for help turning into a story or a program? You can even write it into the chat box if you like, and I will see if I can help you there with it.
So I don't know if you saw, John, that Doreen shared something up a ways. Let me get there. Lynn Woods used to be a place for pirates to hide their bounties, which is pretty good fodder.
It is, yes. And there's lots of stories in the region about pirates, and you can always use a little poetic license. I do that as a storyteller. And I do like to begin again with a little problem, which was during colonial times in the 1690s, there were pirates all up and down the Hudson River, and they would steal, and then they would hide what they got in the woods, your park, until things would calm down. So you could have, if you have a certain old tree, you could say this could be where the pirates probably hid their treasure, and have a little walk with families to perhaps uncover a treasure that you could set. And then you could give kids a little souvenir, even though it could just be, a piece of candy or something like that. But that could be a little bit of an adventure that you could have to coincide with the fact that pirates abounded throughout New York. And Captain William Kidd was hired by the king to try to put an end to piracy along the Hudson River. It was said he went from being a privateer, someone hired by the king to stop pirates, to becoming a pirate himself. And when he got found out, he hid his treasures in your park. And there may be some treasures there, but I always like to tell the families and the kids, don't try to dig them up, because the ghost of Captain William Kidd will rise up and make you keep the treasure in the ground. And so you instead have your own treasure, which could be based on the things found at Glenwood Farms or at other places where your park is. So if anyone else has a question, and of course, this really is a beginning. I know these Zoom meetings or this is a Cisco meeting, as I had, technical issues, but I invite you can follow up. I'll type in my email. I'd be delighted to help you brainstorm ways to create programs. Brainstorm ways, I'll just put that in, from your park's history and heritage, to turn, as even I described with Pound Ridge, a small part of it can become a long time program. For example, again, go back to Pound Ridge. When my friend and the mentor, Nicholas Shumatov, and I'll tell you at the end what his name became, happened when he was wandering to find a long flat rock. And he asked an old timer if he knew anything about this place and this rock. And the old timer said that this was a place where, before the park in the 19th century, people would come to dancing rock. And that inspired Nicholas Shumatov to create, first at that rock, but then out in one of those huge fairy-like fields, a old-time music festival, the Fiddlers Festival. And going from having old-timey bluegrass musicians at this rock, kind of echoing what the farmers would do to entertain themselves in the past, led to, for 20 years, a huge festival. It was the largest festival at any of the parks in Westchester County, drawing 10,000 visitors every June from the late 70s until the early aughts. I think the last one was around 2003. So sometimes just a small bit of history of your park can spark a tremendous event. So I'm here to help you explore those possibilities as well. And I was thinking about this. I often do a program down in Lower Westchester, in near Mamaroneck, actually in the town of Harrison. There's a veterans park, and there's many veterans fields. Why not invite some old veterans to come and share their stories with kids at Veterans Field. And you can shape it. You can talk to the veterans ahead of time, and maybe they have memorabilia, medals, or one or two little stories they might share. You could bring in a color guard and have a little wreath ceremony and honor these veterans. You could perhaps find stories from the local historians of the veterans of past conflicts and find out what their stories are. One beautiful thing we did at one of these parks was to borrow a page from that Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War, and we read letters out loud, had prominent local figures and politicians who would read out loud some of those letters. So that's a thing to do with a little veterans park. Now I'm getting a little note about General William Floyd House and awarded 10,000 acres. It may have been, he may have been, I'm thinking he was awarded that property after the American Revolution, when the new government had no money to pay the veterans, and Washington had to calm rebellion. The soldiers wanted to march from near Newburgh, New York, down to Philadelphia and take over the government and, well, get themselves paid. But Washington put on a pair of spectacles and quelled the rebellion. But the Congress got forced into a solution. They weren't the kind of stuck body we have today. I'm hoping after the elections that will change and people will actually work together, but that's another story. And so the veterans were rewarded, like William Floyd, land. And that became part of what created community after the American Revolution. And you might just find, oh, William Floyd, he got some land. Maybe he was just a simple farmer. But you could perhaps, again, act out some of the chores that he had to do, as I outlined before for Muscoot Farm, with the basket maker, the blacksmith, the milking of the cow, and some other chores, butter making. Those could be things that could be done on William Floyd House Day. So if you expand a little bit upon the idea of what your park's heritage was, you can create a program. Anyone else want to type something in? And I'll see if I can again put my, 30 years experience as a storyteller at your disposal here.
I don't run any parks per se. I work at SUNY Cortland, but most of the parks in my area have, the bulk of the history is Native American history. And I just wondered if you had any examples of programming that's done that's kind of helped educate the population living around there about that heritage, because that is, a lot of them there are stories related to the tribes that lived here, and still do. There's still like pretty strong some of them have very strong communities. So I just wondered if you like any partnerships that maybe have happened in the past, or ideas about that, because I feel like a lot of people don't understand that history, and it could be an opportunity for education.
Oh, completely. Yes. This fellow that I mentioned before, Nicholas Shumatov, followed the interest that you're putting forth. And he not only researched the native peoples, but eventually invited them to come to join the community. And many came saying, well, I'm not really a public speaker, but I want people to know that there still exist native peoples in New York. And so they began to do things like have a little ceremony at the Petroglyph rock, a little blessing. And then he delved into the story of Thanksgiving and invited native peoples to come. And even though a certain aspect was a bit of a downer, to say the least, because many native peoples considered Thanksgiving a kind of day of mourning because of treaties that were eventually broken, they rebuilt the bridge, if you will, by creating kind of a community feast and retelling some of the stories. So even just to have an event where you invite native peoples to be present, and it could just be something as simple as trying to identify a place where the native peoples may have hunted or trapped fish or napped stones could become a wonderful program that reaching out to bring them in and even just to say, come and meet and chat with native peoples here. And they may not have a lot in terms of stories, it's not as if they're still living back in, the 16 and 1700s, but any kind of a union, a bringing together, a meeting, could be a lot of fun. And you have to create an activity about where people can bond. And it could just be to play certain native games or to do, as I mentioned before, maybe have someone who might know about flint knapping or basket making, skills the native peoples may have had. Or maybe they know something about farming, or if the native peoples don't, you could bring something in who might know about native farming methods. And you don't have to pay tons of money to have some expert, even a little bit of a skill that's a little bit interactive. Like, for example, the first Thanksgiving, you could bring in before that someone, and you might just plant together with the native peoples and other people in your community at your park, practice the way Squanto taught the pilgrims to plant, to dig a hole in the ground, put a fish head in, cover it with dirt, and put in the three sisters, corn, bean, and squash. Something as simple as that, done perhaps in the spring, could be a beautiful little ceremony. So again, something simple to bond people together can create those things. Another thing that's you could do, even though it may seem literally a little off the wall, I know of people who feel that many of the stone structures built that you find were made by native peoples, stone structures of mother turtle upon whom the world is built. There's a whole organization that comes and gives tours in parks and shows where there may possibly be these stone structures made by native peoples. There's others who show stone structures that may have been built by ancient Celtic peoples who came here even before the Vikings and left evidence of these structures. Yes, it's a little bit off the wall, but it's fun. What makes it off the wall makes it fun and creates interest in your park. So those are things that people can do. Even to have a botanist, a birder come, make again for interesting programs. Well, we just have a little bit of time. I'm willing to stay because I started late. You may have other programs to go to, but if anyone else has a question, and again, please feel free to email me about your park. I'd be more than honored to help you develop a program, either virtual or in person, to help draw people to your parks. Finally, I'll say I visit many parks and find that it has been increasingly difficult, even before the COVID times, to get people to come out. And that's why you need compelling titles and little bonding events to draw people in. Now, finally, my friend Nicholas Shumatov, because of his work with the native peoples, was given the name He Who Stands Firm in honor of his work creating that bridge in the park where he once worked, Ward Pound Ridge Reservation. So I'll stay with you if anyone wants to type in a final question. You're free, of course, to do so. And if you have to leave, I won't cry, but I may cry if you don't at least send me an email. I need to make amends for being late to this meeting. So ask me for a favor. I'll be happy to do it. Jonathan Kruk at Gmail. Anyone want to type something in?
It is lunchtime, so people might be taking off to go eat.
I know, I want to have
We're
lunch.
only giving them 30 minutes.
All right. Well, I'll let you go and hope that you get in touch, and I'll send a thank you from me. All right. Well, everyone, again, thanks for your patience with my late start. And I hope you will get in touch.
Thank you, Jonathan.
You're very welcome.
That was very fun to watch and listen to.
Well, good. I'm glad it was fun and worth the wait.
And don't worry about being late. We didn't even get, two of our rooms had technical issues until about a third of the way through the